Assalamu alaikum. Before you begin this video, just quickly wanted to let you know that so much of the work on the Quran has been completed on Bayyinah TV. I want you to enjoy systematically studying the Quran from the beginning all the way to the end in brief and then in great detail. And to do that, I'd like for you to sign up on BayyinahTV.com. And once you appreciate what's going on in Bayyinah TV, I want you to become an ambassador for it and share that subscription with friends and family and give it as a gift also. Thank you.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. ولقد ذرأنا لجهنم كثيرا من الجن والإنس لهم قلوب لا يفقهون بها ولهم أعين لا يبصرون بها ولهم آذان لا يسمعون بها أولئك كالأنعام بل هم أضل أولئك هم الغافلون. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. فالحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد, once again everybody, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Today, ayah number 179 of Surah Al-A'raf, where Allah will give us yet another very powerful image. There's a lot to unpack here, and there are some discussions in this ayah that I'm going to kind of give you a quick glossary overview of, because I think for Muslims, these discussions are important to have. I'll be candid with you about the difference of opinion. I probably stand in the minority opinion camp myself on this, so I'll elaborate my position. I think it's a part of intellectual honesty that if I have an opinion on something or I'm convinced of something in my study of the Quran, but that doesn't seem to be a good majority of scholars or interpreters, etc., then I should be candid with you about that and say, hey, I've seen their argument, here's why I don't find it convincing, here's my position, you need to make up your own minds. I'm not trying to tell you to subscribe to one view or the other, but there should be an openness and a transparency when it comes to certain positions. I'm not saying that the position I'm about to share isn't shared by anybody, but it's not in good number. وَلَقَدْ ذَرَأْنَا لِجَهَنَّمَ كَثِيرًا مِنَ الْجِنِّ وَالْإِنسِ. The position has to do with the opening statement in this ayah. Allah says that we created, and in the word ذَرَأَ, there's a direct meaning of creating, but because it's used for the creation of crop, so there's a kind of a kinaya in the word, an implication in the word of spreading out. But that's not the linguistic meaning of the word. It kind of assumes that secondary, added meaning to the word. So we created for Jahannam, and we created and spread out, now this is the translation that's conventional understanding, for Jahannam, many, many out of the jinn and the human beings. Now that statement sounds like Allah created a lot of human beings for one purpose, and what's that? Jahannam. And He created a lot of jinns for the purpose of Jahannam. And that statement is in one way or the other supported by a good number of tafasir when they come to this ayah, that somehow Allah designed certain people and their entire function in existence was actually to end up in Jahannam. This is called, when you say for, in English, if I say I did this for this purpose, right? I did this for this purpose. Then the for is telling you the reasoning behind something, right? For example, I cooked for you, or I cooked for dinner, so for the purpose of dinner, right? So the word for illustrates purpose. That's called ta'lil or illa in Arabic, right? But there are other meanings of the word lam. It's not just for as in illah. It can serve other functions. And one of the functions it can have is aqiba, outcome. Outcome. So, for example, and this could sound sarcastic, you have some of you have children that are older now that you're going to university, right? And you're paying their tuitions, you're paying their college fees. And you pay their college fees and they're missing all their classes and they're failing all their classes and they're taking all that free time and they're hanging out with their friends and doing all kinds of stupid things. And you find out at the end of the semester, right? And you get a notice in the mail, we miss your son. He hasn't showed up at the university, et cetera, right? Is everything okay? And you get this notice and then your son comes home and you're like, this is why I paid your fee. For this reason I paid your fee. For you to go to the restaurant, for you to go to this place, for you to go play football. This is why I paid all these tuitions. This is why I go to work. I go to work for you to go play around. Now, you said for, and if the son's really stupid, he says, really? That's why you did it? Huh? You could have just given me the money. That statement, to put it in a nicer English word, that's lament. Meaning, I did all of this, and I did it for this tragedy. That would be kind of a lam al-aqiba meaning. It's similar to an incident in the life of Musa alayhi salam. Musa alayhi salam was crossing the water. Fir'aun is behind him. The water has opened up. He's crossing the water. As he's crossing the water, he's got women, children, old people. They're all getting through. And the thing is, Fir'aun is not coming after an army. He's coming after unarmed civilians and babies and moms and old people. He wants to commit genocide. That's what Fir'aun wants to do. And including the Prophet of Allah, after seeing all of the 9 signs, after seeing all of that, he's still got murderous intent and he's gathered all of his armies and he wants to, ثُمَّ أَتُوهُمْ صَفًّا. So he wants to come at them once and for all and end this problem, kill the vermin, basically. And Musa alayhi salam turns to Allah and says, إِنَّكَ أَتَيْتَ فِرْعَوْنَ عَلَى فِرْعَوْنَ زِينَةً وَأَمْوَالًا. You gave these people, these descendants of the pharaohs, one king after another, they have this entire lineage, right? Because this is a dynasty for thousands of years, centuries and centuries. You gave them such beauty. You gave them all kinds of wealth. لِيُضِلُّوا عَنْ سَبِيلِكَ. So they could misguide other people from your path. Now, one way to read that is, Ya Allah, you made them really wealthy and you made them really powerful because your purpose, Ya Allah, was so that they could serve the job of misguiding other people. But that's not how I would read it. I would read that as lam al-aqiba. Look at what you gave them, look at what they could have done with that for the world, and how grateful they could have been, and look at what they ended up doing instead. That would be the lam al-aqiba kind of reading. And that's the kind of reading I read here. It's a lament from Allah. Allah has created such remarkable creation, the human being. Allah says, إِلَّا مَنْ رَحِمَ رَبُّكَ وَلِذَلِكَ خَلَقَهُمْ. Except for the ones Allah shows, your Rabb shows rahmah to, and that is for that purpose, meaning the purpose of rahmah is why He made them. The reason I have a harder time accepting the alternative explanation, that some people were created for hell to begin with. The reason I don't find that a convincing explanation is then everything else in Islam stops making sense. At least to me. It's very difficult for it to make sense with accepting that explanation. Why? Because from the very beginning, the whole story with Adam alayhi salam happens, Iblis disobeys, and Allah shows the children of Adam were all there in Surah Al-A'raf, and Allah shows us Jannah and Jahannam, essentially. And then He says, so لَمَنْ تَبِعَكَ مِنْهُمْ. He turns to Iblis and says, whoever follows you among them, who's the them? All of us. We're witness to this entire drama. And so He says, whoever of them follows you, He says, لَأَمْلَأَنَّ جَهَنَّمَ مِنْكُمْ أَجْمَعِينَ. I will fill hell with all of you. What happens? If you follow Him. He didn't say at that time, by the way, some of you were just created for that barbecue. It's just a matter of time. He said, no, if whoever of them follows you, whoever of them follows. And then even the words in the Quran, describing the Quran, هُدًى لِلنَّاسِ. a guidance for people. Or the dua of Ibrahim alayhi salam, people should come here from all corners of the world. He didn't say only people that are not meant for Jahannam. He meant people. هذا بيان للناس. This is a clarification for all people. وما أرسلناك إلا رحمة للعالمين. إلا حطب Jahannam. No, it's not like that. We sent you as a rahmah for all nations and all people, Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam is told. Except for people that are supposed to just burn in hell. They were just made for, they were fuel for the fire anyway. No. They chose that path. What's further, pushing me in that direction, even textually localized to this area, meaning in this particular ayah. If you go just a couple of ayat before, Allah says, sa'a mathalan, the example we talked about yesterday with the dog panting. The very next ayah is, what a terrible example that is. Allah Himself says, sa'a mathala, what a terrible example that is. Al-qawmu alladhina kadhabu bi-ayatina, the nation that calls Allah's ayat a lie. Wa anfusahum kanu yadhlimun. And they're doing wrong to their very selves. One of the explanations some scholars offered for this, on the other camp, the camp where some people are made for Jahannam, in that camp, one of the explanations offered was that, we all have the desire to do bad and to do good. We have, in the nafs, we have فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا. So we have the impulse. You want to look at something that's desirable and you don't want to put your eyes down. There's an impulse that's inside you. There's an anger that's inside you. And you want to, you get angry, you want to slap someone across the face or punch somebody in the nose or whatever. There's an emotion that comes, and that emotion is not under your control. If somebody says something to make you angry, it's not like you have so much iman that all of a sudden you don't feel anger. You'll feel anger, you'll still feel anger, you'll still feel temptation, you'll still feel an urge, you'll still feel and you'll still feel pride, you'll still feel some sense of comparison. You can't just say, I'm a Muslim now, I don't have hasad anymore, good luck. No, that's not true. You have hasad all the time. You have hasad of the guy that's three cars ahead of you in the traffic signal, who got out and you got the red. You're like, it's a mini hasad, but it's hasad. It's a capital, lowercase ha. Right, but it's there. You have emotions, you can't control them. Then he says, okay, so you have these emotions, right? And then you have the power to control these emotions, right? So you've got this fire, and then you've got the fire extinguisher. You've got both inside you, right? And for some people, Allah just made their extinguisher weaker. And some people, Allah made their extinguisher stronger. So for the people whom Allah made that extinguisher weaker, when they get really angry, they're not able to help it. They'll throw a punch. They'll break a wall. They'll push their mom when they're a teenager and walk out of the house. Or they'll beat up their wife or some, because their extinguisher is smaller. They don't have the kind of brakes that other people have. And I personally, with all due respect, do not accept that explanation. I believe that every human being has an ability to contain themselves. وَأَمَّا مَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ وَنَهَى النَّفْسَ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ. The Quran is saying, whoever would fear their Rabb and would stop themselves from their feeling. So the impulse that comes, Allah has actually given us the ability to put a stop to it. However, there's something even more. There's something even on top of that. And what is, to me, on top of that is divine intervention. Allah gave us something called the ruh, which is a divine light from Allah. It's a burhan from Allah. That in the end, above it all, if the anger is, what if the fire and the extinguisher are equal in power? What happens then? Well, who's going to win? And then at the end of it all, there's something Allah has given us that overwhelmingly pushes us in the direction of the light, towards right. And that is the ruh, the amr of Allah that Allah put inside every human being. That's a miraculous gift Allah gave us. Which at the end of it all, that is what separates us more than anything else from all the other species. We have an ability to do good in the most difficult circumstances. Somebody could be tortured and beat to leave the religion, and every cell in their body is saying, just do shirk, it's easier, man. Go back to your family, life will be good again. And he won't do it. Something inside him is so powerful that even in the face of all of the incentives to go in the wrong direction, he won't do it. He won't do it. So this is my reading, again, not majority, of this ayah, that we ended up creating so many from the human beings and the jinn for the tragedy of them ending up in Jahannam. I'm adding tragedy in parentheses because I'm using lam al-aqibah. that they ended, all for them to end up in hellfire. And now Allah is describing, you know what, like I was giving you the college kid example. I paid your fee, I went to the job, I got you this, I even got you a car, I got you a bus card, I got you this, I got you money for lunch. So I did all of, and then you do this? This is what you do? We even moved from our old home to a more expensive area to pay more rent so we could be closer to your university, to get you tuition. All these things you did. Why, the more gifts that you've been given, the more you owe. And the more sad, the more disappointing it is that you didn't live up to the gifts that you were given, isn't it? So now Allah will mention the gifts that they were given. Now, we're not talking about the college kid in the crazy example. Some of you did that and already got yelled at by your parents. You're like, who told him? Why is he talking about my family situation? Yeah, your dad talked to me. He didn't. But I got you for a second. One young man was like, لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ لَا يَفْقَهُونَ بِهَا. They have hearts that they don't think deeply with. They have hearts that they don't think with. وَلَهُمْ آذَانٌ وَلَهُمْ أَعْيُنٌ لَا يُبْصِرُونَ بِهَا. They have eyes that they don't see with. وَلَهُمْ آذَانٌ لَا يَسْمَعُونَ بِهَا. And they have ears that they don't listen with. أُولَٰئِكَ كَالْأَنْعَامِ. They are like cattle. بَلْ هُمْ أَضَلُّ. They're even far more lost than cattle. They're even more wasted than cattle. Dalal is being lost. Dalal is also being wasted. They're far more lost than cattle. They're even more of a waste than cattle. أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْغَافِلُونَ. Those are the people that are ultimately unaware, heedless, clueless. Now, let's try to unpack what's going on here. So the first thing, let's get that out of the way. A lot of times students come up to me, Ustad, I have a question. I'm a student of science, and in science, the heart doesn't do any thinking, and the Quran says that the hearts, they don't think with them. Obviously, we don't think with the hearts. So that's why I'm not praying anymore, because of this ayah. Okay. This is what you all sound like to me when you ask a dumb question. So let's talk about that. No, I sound like that because I used to sound like that in college. Anyway, so the Quran is not a book of science. The Quran is revelation from Allah speaking in natural language, in the language of the people. People don't speak in scientific language. People don't say, pass me the hydrogen dioxide, right? So that it can, the liquid may pass through my larynx and go through, nobody, just give me water, I'm thirsty. You don't speak in science, you speak in human normal language. Your grandma doesn't say, this baby, for example, this baby, when I see him, there are certain, hormones and certain neurons that fire in my brain, causing me to stimulate endorphins that cause me to smile. She says, he brings joy to my heart. Nobody speaks in science. We speak in normal language, right? And we speak in unscientific language all the time, and it's a normal part of life. When somebody says, man, you broke my heart. She broke my heart, man. Did she? I think we should get a scan. That's pretty, what kind of punch was this? And how are you alive if she broke your heart? And then grandma says, oh, my grandchildren, they've stolen my heart. Is there a replacement surgery that happened? Nobody has a problem in speaking unscientific language all the time because it is a part of the human condition. We don't speak literally all the time. In fact, most of the time we don't. I love the sunset on the beach. Well, the sun didn't set. I love as the sun is sinking into the ocean. Actually, the sun's not sinking into the ocean at all. That's scientifically inaccurate. Just slap that kid and just enjoy the sun sinking into the ocean. Okay, because it's not the language of science. Now the thing is, having said that, there is something more going on here. The Quran is describing two realities. We all know that. There's a seen reality and there's an unseen reality, isn't it? It started with an acknowledgement that we believe in an unseen reality, الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْغَيْبِ. In that unseen reality, there are angels. In that unseen reality, there's the afterlife. In that unseen reality, there are jinn. In that unseen reality, there's rizq coming from the sky. There's an entire unseen reality in which there's a record, there's a book that's being filled with my deeds, my works, every day. Kitabun marqum. And it's being populated more and more and more. There are souls that are traveling every night out of their bodies in that unseen world, and then coming back in the unseen world. There are people that are going into their graves. We think they're going down, but they're actually going up. And that's happening in the unseen world. So there's so much going on. And in the seen world, there are people that are shuhada. And in the unseen world, بَلْ أَحْيَاء عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ يُرْزَقُونَ. No, in fact, they're alive right now, being provided for by their Rabb. There is an unseen reality that the Quran is constantly describing. And the fact that it is unseen doesn't make it unreal. It's real. And then there's a seen part of me, my body, and there's an unseen part of me, my ruh, right? Now let's take that further. There's a seen heart, and there's also an unseen heart inside me. There's a seeing eyes, the material eyes. There's also spiritual eyes, the unseen eyes. There's a seeing, there's a visual, you could do an auditory test on your hearing. That's the hearing that belongs to the seen world, the material world. And there's a spiritual hearing that belongs to the unseen world. Even within the capabilities Allah has given me, these faculties Allah has given me, they have a seen reality, a material reality, and a spiritual reality. And the Quran is commenting on which one? The spiritual reality. And what do we turn these conversations into? The material reality, and say, the Quran is not talking about my biology class, therefore I'm not impressed. Because we are now in an age of, I even call it scientism, almost the worship of the material reality, the worship of material, so that the immaterial or the amaterial, the supernatural, or I don't even call it supernatural, it's the metaphysical, not the physical, the metaphysical, is irrelevant. What's crazy to me is, especially now with quantum physics and the way physics has moved forward in the last century, physicists understand the unseen as a greater reality than the seen. Talk to it doesn't matter if a physicist is a believer in the unseen or not, or in our concept of the unseen or not. Speak with them. Science itself has now understood its own limits and understands that there is something much greater. There are dimensions beyond our perception, multiple layers and layers and layers of those dimensions. And we are simply a very small piece of a much larger puzzle. That's what scientists are talking about now. I'm no scientist, but when in study of another surah, when I was looking into the subject matter, it's remarkable. Many scientists actually, who were hard materialists, when quantum physics emerged first, in the first 20, 30 years, maybe you don't know this, many scientists went into deep depression. Because the universe that they were studying that was eternal, firm, locked in place, all of a sudden quantum physics came and said, well, it can turn into energy and then turn into nothing. And then, really? Then it's all nothing. None of this is anything. And then they started writing depressing poetry. Scientists in Europe, in America, writing depressing poetry after discovering the developments in quantum physics. This has happened within the last 100 years. So now, and there's some other interesting things. There are some people I've met that are Muslims working in the field of neuroscience and cardiology. And some interesting developments are being now discovered, which I think it's cool additions to what Allah has said. I don't think it depends on it. And that is that now they're discovering that the heart actually has an independent system from the brain. And in fact, in some cases, the heart is sending messages to the brain. So it's pretty cool stuff. And I don't have the brains for it to study the scientific journals, but eventually I'll probably sit with some of these researchers and do interviews with them about what Allah is saying and what they're finding in their research. But regardless, even if we never had that research, the point being made, the fundamental point being made is there is an unseen dimension to my heart, and there's a seen dimension to my heart. Didn't Allah say their hearts became hard like stone? Right? If you did surgery of the kafir whose heart became like stone according to the Quran, if you opened up Abu Lahab's heart, you would not find a rock, I can guarantee you. It would be squishy and soft. Because what you opened up is the material heart. And what Allah is commenting on is the spiritual heart. Now what's the difference between them? The difference is your ability to perceive the unseen. That's the point. The ability to see ayat. That's the difference. So let's figure out how. Let's say somebody is looking at a tree. And I was giving you this example yesterday. They've studied botany, they've studied plants, they know everything about this tree. They know its genome, they know its specific kind of variation, they know how old it is, how healthy it is. They can tell you all these things about that tree. But they see nothing in that tree that points them to something greater. Nothing. And then there's somebody whose heart, because they're looking at it with their brain. That person was looking at it with their brain. But then there's somebody who's looking at that same tree, even though they're looking at it with their brain too, they're also looking at it with their heart. And then they see, why is that tree here? It provides such beautiful shade. Who put that tree in place? How can a seed that has no life just burst open and turn into a gigantic tree that has life? And then that tree continued to produce fruits that benefit. And even within them, there are seeds that produce even more life. And somehow, I'm the beneficiary of all of it, me and my animals. Somebody's doing this for me. This is too well orchestrated. Because all I did was put a seed in the ground. I didn't do anything else. I just put some water on it. I didn't engineer the way it's going to pop open. I didn't engineer the way it's going to mature. I didn't engineer the materials that you needed, the construction material needed for its roots to spread. I didn't do any of that. All of that, it engineered itself. Now he's looking at it with his heart. And he's trying to find the answer to that question. The question, where's life coming from? How is it coming? لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ لَا يَفْقَهُونَ بِهَا. They have hearts, but they refuse to think with them deeply, to understand with them deeply. Fiqh is al-fahm al-amiq. Fiqh in Arabic is deep understanding. They want to get to the depth of something. Allah is describing that every human being is capable of deep thinking. I'm glad, Jawad, you brought it up to me today. There's a book. I haven't read it, but he gave me the synopsis. So I have smart people around me. Thinking fast and thinking slow. Every day we think fast. Every day. You get up and you brush your teeth. You are not thinking about it. Or you barely, like a split-second thought, you brush your teeth. You get in the car. You get dressed for work. You put your socks on. Or you opened your fast. Or you took your shoes off when you got to the... These are all thinking fast. But the biggest mistakes in our life, all of us have made mistakes in our life. All of them were because we were thinking fast. That same mistake, if you just slowed down and said, let me think about the consequences of what I'm about to do. Should I really be doing this? Is this good for me? Is this going to hurt me? Is this going to hurt others? Is this better for me in the long run? If I was really thinking about this clearly, and not in the heat of the moment, would I be doing this? That would be thinking slow. Slow down and think through something. Most of our mistakes happen because we think fast and we don't think. So it's interesting, Allah says, كَلَّا بَلْ تُحِبُّونَ الْعَاجِلَةِ وَتَذَرُونَ الْآخِرَةِ. You love quick, Allah says. You all love quick. And you put off the later. You put off the afterlife. So we have this impulsive kind of thinking. This is the kind of thinking that marketers understand really well in the world of marketing. I know a lot of young people are really going in the direction of marketing and social media marketing and analytics, and eventually with AI and other things, they're going to be studying the way our pupils dilate when we look into our webcams to see which images are working better, and how quickly the eye to scroll responses. They're going to study that. They're going to track that stuff, right? Because they want to track human behavior as much as possible to capture your attention as much as possible, right? But I'll tell you, back in the day, the ancient world of marketing, when I was studying marketing, in the days of carts and horses, we used to study grocery stores. And in grocery stores, you'll notice that most people come in for breads, milk, and eggs. Bread, milk, and eggs. So you would think, because they come for bread, milk, and eggs, you should put it where? Right next to the door. Hey, got it? Go. Where did they put bread, milk, and eggs? They put it in the farthest corner of the store possible. And you have to literally, which way is the bread, milk, and eggs? Oh, you have to go here, here, here. You have to go through the chips and no, sorry, crisps. I apologize. Crisps, the fizzies. You have to go through the ice creams. You have to go through all the stupid stuff. But all that's, because, bread, milk, eggs, bread is going to take time. You're going to put it in a toaster. Eggs you're going to have to boil, and that's work. But the donut and the chocolate and you don't got to wait for nothing. You're just immediate. And what they'll do then is they'll take some of the kids' toys, even though it's not a toy store. Grocery stores will put kids' toys at the cashier's aisle. Because you're going to be in line at the cashier's aisle, and your kid's going to be with you, and the kid's going to be like, and they know. And you'll do anything to make your kids stop doing the drama that they're doing. So they will hold your kids' emotions over you, and in that hostage situation, you will buy that stuff. Because you're thinking what? Slow. That's slow thinking. Or thinking fast, rather. This is impulsive buying. And they depend on impulsive buying. So many sales are driven by impulsive buying, subhanAllah. Right? When you're conditioned that way, you don't think about bigger things. But let's step back from this. I've talked about some of these things in other talks, but I want to talk about some additional dimensions of this that I've not spoken about before. As believers, this ayah is about those who don't believe that, they end up in Jahannam anyway, but the tragedy is something that even a believer can experience. And how is that? Allah can give you awareness. Allah can make you aware of His deen, of the reality of the unseen, of the truth of Judgment Day, of the power of His words, of the wisdom, the endless treasures of wisdom that are inside this book that they change your perspective, man. Nothing seems small anymore. Nothing is petty. If you've been keeping up with the parables that we're going through, your worldview is morphing. If you're thinking about this all day, if you're spending some hours just thinking about this, then the way you see your world has changed. Your horizons have gotten bigger. They've expanded. But then, this is not something that stays on autopilot, because that was slow thinking. You have to stop and contemplate. You have to stop and think about it. But the world functions on fast thinking. So you go back in this world of quick, and slowly that horizon that opened up because of contemplating Allah's words, that horizon starts getting smaller again. And even though functionally you're still a believer, you're still praying, you're fasting, you're going through the motions, the world that was becoming so big in front of you started becoming small and myopic again, and you have the heart still, but you go through the motion of the prayer, but nothing really was felt. And you're reciting the Quran, but nothing really was felt. لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ لَا يَفْقَهُونَ بِهَا لَهُمْ أَعْيُنٌ لَا يُبْصِرُونَ بِهَا. They have eyes, they can't see with it. Can you imagine the tragedy, the extreme tragedies in Mecca? There are people who can see Rasulullah ﷺ with their own eyes, and they just see a man. They just see someone who's insane. They see someone who's causing a problem for their business. They see someone who drove their son into madness by making them Muslim. They see someone who's a problem for their tribal hierarchy. That's all they see. Then he moves to Medina, some of the rabbis see him and they see someone who's taking away the attention that was coming towards them. They used to give their sermon, the rabbi used to give their sermon and everybody used to gather, and now Rasulullah speaks and everybody gathers. He's like, he's taking a crowd. What is this? I gotta post some videos to expose what he really is, and I gotta do some defamation or refutations of Muhammad. So I said, we gotta make some anti-Muhammad content, because otherwise this is gonna take all the whole market share. That's what they're thinking. They see the Rasul of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They hear the word of Allah. They hear the word of Allah, and all they hear is a problem. How do we respond to that? How do we challenge that? How do we not get people to listen to that? That's all they hear. Isn't that tragic? لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ لَا يَفْقَهُونَ بِهَا لَهُمْ أَعْيُنٌ لَا يُبْصِرُونَ بِهَا. And it's as if Allah started with the hearts. Then He goes to the eyes, right? And the hearts is the comprehensive. Then He goes to the eyes. But then He comes to what I feel is the greatest tragedy of all. They have ears and they don't listen with them. And why do I think that's the greatest tragedy? Because it's the key to the whole thing. The hearing is the key to revelation. The Rasul ﷺ can no longer be seen, but the Quran he was given can still be heard. Right? The miracle of Allah, the lasting miracle of Allah, is something that was meant to be heard. And so you'll have people that have ears, but they can't hear with them. They hear sounds, but they don't hear what Allah is actually saying. They don't hear something that penetrates into the heart. There's nothing. Nothing happens. لَهُمْ آذَانٌ لَا يَسْمَعُونَ بِهَا. This idea of you're hearing it, but you're not really hearing it. You're seeing, but you're not really seeing. You're thinking, but you're thinking from here, but you lock this up. You can't think from here anymore. لا يفقهون بها. The qulub is used very strategically here. لهم قلوب لا يفقهون بها. As if to say our minds only go so far, and then the heart allows you to reach deep understanding. Fiqh comes from the heart, actually. لهم قلوب لا يفقهون بها. And then he gives the parable. And the example is, these people are comparable to, أولئك, those people are comparable to al-an'am, cattle. What a cattle. We just saw a dog, right? Previously? We've seen rain, we've seen crop, we've seen a dog, we've seen sheep. We've seen a lot of farm imagery, isn't it? It's a lot of farm imagery in this, in the Quran. And that's a continuation now, the image of a cow, the image of a sheep. And if you look at, let's understand the word an'am first. An'am in Arabic, which I translate as cattle, comes from the Arabic word nu'uma. Nu'uma means softness or gentleness. From the same word we get ni'ma, blessing. A blessing is something that brings about softness or gentleness in your life, and that's why it's called ni'ma. Jannat al-Na'im are gardens of luxury and comfort and softness and gentleness. The pillows are comfortable, the bedding is comfortable, the company is comfortable. Everything makes you feel more relaxed, and that's why it's Jannat al-Na'im. Okay? So the word an'am is because the cattle, they move very gently. The cow moves very slowly, right? The lion doesn't move like that. The lion pounces, the cat pounces. The squirrel moves fast. The snake moves quickly. But the cow is just relaxed, you know? Now, here's the thing. This was many years ago. I was thinking about this ayah, and I was driving in California one time. And California has, in the center of California, there's a lot of farmland. So you'll see on either side of the road, there's a lot of cattle, a lot of, different kinds of animals. Every once in a while, some other, wild animal might pop up, like a fox or something, right? Or a deer or something like that. The thing with those animals is, if they hear a horn or they hear something, they move quickly. And sometimes the cows would come very close to the highway. And there's 18-wheeler trucks going a good 80 miles an hour. And the cow's eating grass, and the cow continues to eat grass. And it goes by so close that the fur on the cow goes, but the cow still, like it has no spatial awareness of, you're 2 feet away from becoming a burger, right? Animals respond quickly. A bird responds quickly. A chicken responds quickly. Try to catch one. A pigeon responds quickly. A fly responds quickly. A snake responds quickly. They have these hyper reflexes, even dogs actually. The reason dogs are guardians is because they can smell at a distance, they can hear at a distance, they can feel vibrations at a distance, immediately. While the cows are still like, the dog's doing his thing. It's guarding the perimeter. Allah says these people are being compared to what? Cows. Cows. Because cows went through many, 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 many thousands of years of being domesticated from the wild to the point where they feel completely safe so long as they're inside the perimeter. Nothing can go wrong. And even if something goes wrong, they will walk slowly to safety. That's it. That's all they got to do. Allah says they're comparable to cattle. They have no sense of the real danger around them. They have no sense of reality around them. All they need to do is eat, poop, get the milk taken out of them, and then one day turn into beef. That's it. That's it. And by the way, the imagery is also being compared to a previous image where, remember, somebody calls out to animals like sheep and cows and they respond, right? So it's building up on that imagery, meaning they do respond, but they don't respond to something thoughtful. They just respond to time to eat, something, and they'll go. Or they'll make another call and they'll get up. Or it'll be a bell or something mindless. And that's what they'll respond to. Allah is describing most people are like these mindless zombies that are just there to eat, sleep. You know, even though I'm a gamer myself, I like the analogy of, game addicts. You know, they have this basement in their mom's house, and the sun goes up and the sun goes down, and they're, empires rise and fall outside. COVID came and left. Didn't need a mask, never left. Just give me my what's its or something, and let me just, Mom, where's my food? They're just an'am. They're lost in here. That's all it is. You don't need anything else. You can just you're immersed in that world. And what is social media and these devices, these blessings and curses that we have now? What are they doing? They're turning us into cattle. We're just consuming. Instead of consuming grass, you're just consuming feeds. Sitting in the same place, not moving around. Some people go to the bathroom, don't come out for 2 hours. Don't even know what happened. Hey, Ramadan's over? So, they have these, what's the tragedy? Qulub, a'yun, adhan, hearts, eyes, ears. These are remarkable faculties that Allah gave. And Allah is saying, I gave you such powerful gifts, you didn't use them. And that's how you ended up in Jahannam. That's how you ended up there. لهم قلوب لا يفقهون بها لهم أعين لا يبصرون بها ولهم آذان لا يسمعون بها. I was thinking about this ayah for myself, for just myself. And I feel sometimes, more and more, that I'm, I have stages of, I have an'am stages for myself. Like I'm studying and I'm learning and I'm teaching and all of that. But sometimes it's only in the lecture where I'm mentally engaged with what I'm learning and teaching, what I'm studying. But other times, and those are the best times, these ayat are in my head even when I'm walking and doing the groceries, or I'm taking the baby for a walk, or I'm looking at a tree and I'm experiencing what I'm telling you we should be experiencing. Other times I'm not experiencing it. Other times it's raining and I'm like, oh, it's raining. But sometimes it's raining and I'm thinking, أَنزَلْنَا مِنَ السَّمَاءِ مَاءً. And when I do stock of my own self, I realize I'm not aware of the ayat around me majority of the time. Majority of the time, I'm also a cow. I feel like I'm a cow. That's a scary acknowledgement, but it is. It's an important acknowledgement. And to me, this ayah is a wake-up call for all of us, because Allah is saying, and myself included, Allah says, أُولَٰئِكَ كَالْأَنْعَامِ. He says, بَلْ هُمْ أَضَلُّ. They're even more lost and more of a waste than cattle. This part gets me. Okay, comparing us to cattle was bad enough. But the cattle were made for a purpose. They were made to just eat, and they were made to give milk, and then they were made to become a burger. And that's it. And them being dulled, and them just eating and going back to their shed, they at least fulfilled their purpose. Because that's all they were made for. It's not like we needed cows to design buildings. We didn't need that. But you weren't made like the cow. You were made so much better. So you being lost is forget being like the cow, that at least even at its most basic rudimentary level, its primitive existence, it fulfills a purpose. You are even worse because you don't even fulfill any purpose. You fulfill no purpose. بَلْ هُمْ أَضَلُّ. They're even more lost. There's also an interesting thing about cattle, that even though they don't have deeper thinking, they do respond to a call, don't they? Because the imagery was, the one who calls, they respond. يَنْعِقُوا بِمَا لَا يَسْمَعُوا إِلَّا دُعَاءً وَنِدَاءً. But if you notice the people of ghafla, if you notice previous parables, you notice somebody wandering in the land and his companions are calling him, and can he respond? No, because he's deaf, he's mute, he's lost. And his ashab are calling him, يَدْعُونَهُ إِلَى الْهُدَى, but you can't hear them, he's just in his own world lost. So you're even, as dull as the cow is, you're even more dull. You're even more lost in your sensory, your understanding of reality. And then Allah says, and by the way, أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْغَافِلُونَ. Those are the people that are ultimately unaware. This is what ghafla actually is. Now the word ghafla, this is the last thing I'll share with you for today, because I told you this passage, concluding with 179, is actually about ghafla. Couple of things about that. The very next ayah is about Allah's beautiful names. وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى فَادْعُوهُ بِهَا. So beautiful. Because what's the antidote to ghafla? Remind yourself of the ultimate reality, and that's Allah. And every one of those names will open up, lift another curtain that was on your eyes. It'll make you less of a cow and more of a human again, and less of a cow and more of a human again. Every one of those names is unveiling the truth for you and for me. Call on Him with those names. Hear yourself say those names of Allah. Allah has the most beautiful names. The correlation with what's happening before is actually Allah saying, come back and realize who your Rabb is. You'll realize who you are. You'll realize who you are. This reminds me of what Allah says in Surah Al-Hashr. When He says, وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ نَسُوا اللَّهَ فَأَنْسَاهُمْ أَنفُسَهُمْ. Don't become like people who forgot Allah. Allah made them forget who they are themselves. I mean, it sounds like they forgot Allah and they forgot that they're even human. They started living an animal cow existence, or worse than cow existence. That's all that was left. There's a couple of dimensions to discuss here on Ghafilun. There's many ways to describe consciousness, but I'm going to try to give you an understanding of it from one way of thinking about it from the Qur'an's perspective. Think of your mind or your awareness in your head like layers in an ocean. And just imagine that there's multiple kinds of density, right? At the top layer is your quick thinking. Like if you're walking down the street, you see a bus, you see a store, immediately you can tell that's a bus, that's a store, you hear sounds. That entered your first layer. You opened up your phone, you saw a text message, immediately you can read it and understand it. It's in your first layer. Now, that's because you are dealing with the immediate, you're always thinking about the immediate, and you're filling your head with so much of the immediate that first layer starts getting filled. So you don't have as much energy to think one layer deeper, to go one layer deeper. So you're stuck at a shallow level of thought, right? To get any deeper, you got to stop doing fast thinking, you got to do slow thinking. You know, my team was really eager to put together like 30-second clips of my lectures. Let's take a joke out and put it on YouTube as a short. Or let's put like a little zinger out, and then put some Islamic music in the background. And then it's going to get lots of views because it's like a quick, like, oh, that was good. And it's going to get quick shares, right? But you know what? Then we're encouraging quick thinking, isn't it? Like, from an algorithm perspective, if I gave these reminders for 7 or 8 minutes, they'd have a lot more views, right? But I'm encouraging slow thinking, because tadabbur requires time. في خلق السماوات إن في خلق السماوات واختلاف الليل والنهار لآيات. The pondering the sky's ayat and the earth's ayat takes time. These are time-consuming, mind-engulfing activities. So you need a deeper layer of thought, some more concentration, and that's work. See, opening up and reading a text message or noticing there's a store and a bus and a whatever, that doesn't take any effort. That takes no effort. And it can fill your mind very quickly. But engaging in focused, purposeful thought, it requires actual effort from you. And if you're so addicted to useless little bites of data all the time, coming at you, you lose the ability. You start losing the ability to be able to focus on one thing. You're focusing on one thing, you're like, where's my phone? I didn't touch it for 20 seconds. Oh, I gotta do something. Let me just check my messages. Let me just do this. Because you can't focus anymore. And Now, if you do get one layer deeper, that's just one layer deeper. Now you could see, maybe you could start to notice something more spiritual. But let's not talk about the spiritual. Let's talk about most people. You know, in the world, you have people that are doing basic jobs. You know, they're driving a bus, or they're working at a store, or they're a construction worker, things, basic jobs, right? Then there are people that are doing more executive level jobs. Then there are people that are doing, even higher level exec jobs. Then there are people that are like CEOs of billion-dollar corporations. You know the difference between them? Short-term and long-term thinking. People who got a higher degree job is because they invested long-term in some kind of education and training and eventually got to that position. And that was their long-term plan. Like, my long-term plan is I'm going to get that job. Great. You were able to think longer term. You were able to think deeper than most people. You didn't just think about today, this weekend, next weekend. You were thinking about 10 years from now, right? And you sacrificed a lot of your immediate, pleasure for the long-term goal. Great. Good for you. You became a doctor. You became an engineer. You were able to make your business succeed because you had a long-term plan. Then there are people above that, like, real estate giants and bankers and these kind of conglomerate business people, right? They're not thinking about next year or 2 years. They got a 50-year plan. They got 70-year projections. They're thinking massively big. So the more you move up in the world, the more powerful you see individuals, institutions, organizations. One of the things you'll notice in them is either they or the people around them think very, very long term. They think even deeper and deeper and deeper. They dive deeper. And they're thinking more and more about the future. They think this is going to happen 5 years from now, 10 years from now. There are people that invested, for example, in AI 7 years ago, 8 years ago. And now it's starting to emerge. But they were first comers into the field, right? Now bring that to perspective with what Allah is saying. We, Muslims, we're supposed to have the longest term thinking. Longest term. What are we going to do? What is our next generation going to do? What is our generation's next generation going to do? And how are we going to face Allah in the akhirah? The problem now has become, we think of right now, and then we think of the akhirah. We think nothing else. We barely think of the akhirah, but if we do, it's just now and akhirah. Don't worry about everything in between. The entire imagery of planting a seed, of taking your time, of growing something and nurturing something, what is Allah teaching us? You're supposed to think of now, you're supposed to think of tomorrow, and of next week, and of next month, and of next year, and 10 years from now, and 100 years from now, and your akhirah. We're supposed to we'll have the full chain of thoughtfulness in our minds. That's the kind of thinking we should develop. We can't have that if we become cattle. We can't have that if we have generations of Muslims being raised in families. You better get a good job. That's the highest that's it. You ask a young girl, what are you going to do when you grow up? I'm going to have a big wedding, like my sister. That's it. That's the ceiling you gave your little girl. Like that's going to be the happiest day of my life. Why is that the ultimate goal? Why is a car, a job, that kind of office? Why is that a goal? In fact, I question young Muslims. I'm hard on them. But Muslims come to me sometimes asking for motivation. They're depressed. It's like, tell me something I should do. I was like, what do you want to do? I want to serve the ummah. Like how? Potatoes? What do you want to serve? How do you want to serve the ummah? I want to study Islam. What are you going to do with that? I'm going to give da'wah. To who? The youth. What do you know about the youth? What's your financial plan? How are you going to take care of a family? What are you going to do that's not already being done? What's a void that needs to be filled? What's a service that you're going to provide? How are you going to bring about an impact? By talking, or is there something more you have in mind? Is there a systematic change you want to bring? Is there a plan in your head? Is there a vision in your head? Is there somebody else's vision that you subscribe to that say, I want to be part of that vision? There's something more, or do you want to just come to me and say, I want to do something, I don't know what. Just tell me what to do. I don't endorse that kind of thinking. I don't like it. I don't encourage it. I don't feel sympathy for it. Because You shouldn't be told what you should do. You should have eyes to see where the gaps are. You should see where the problem lies. You should see what kind of solution you should be a part of. You should think bigger. Think bigger. Have long goals. Goals that are much bigger than your life. They're much bigger than your life. And you're ready to give yourself to them. And then, that's the thing. That's long-term thinking, right? But from long-term thinking, you have to come down to short-term thinking. From long to short-term. So I'm sharing something personal with you as an extension of this dars. But that is that, in the long term, I have, for myself, for Bayyinah, for the work I want to leave behind, I think about death a lot. I think about what am I going to leave behind? What's my investment for standing in front of Allah? Because I got a lot to answer for, so I got to leave something good behind. Because I need the commissions, into the akhirah. So I got to think about what's the most effective use of the few years or days, whatever Allah has left for me, what's the most optimal use of my time that I could do something that can residually benefit myself and also do something good here. And when I think about that, I'm thinking about, okay, I need to have a 1-year plan. I need to have a 5-year plan. Where am I going to see myself in 10 years? What's my vision for 10 years? And that might change, but at least I have some sketch in my head. But once I have that sketch in my head, then I tell my team, hey, this is what we're doing this month. The sketch is done. This is what I'm doing this month. And once the month is in front of me, the rest of the universe doesn't exist. The only thing that matters is this month. And once Ramadan starts, I'm not thinking about the whole month. I'm just thinking about today. And as soon as this dars is done, all I'm thinking about is tomorrow. That's it. My entire universe is limited to. Now I can be a cow. Now I can do that. Now I could put blinders on like a horse and just focus on what's right in front of me. Why? Because I laid out something. The map is laid out. Now focus on the task at hand. Now just give yourself to it. So there is this two-part thinking. And the people that are lost and the people that are unaware, being lost and being unaware is clearly about not having defined goals. You don't even know where you're heading. That's why you're lost. That's what ghafla is, isn't it? Unaware. I'm unaware of where I'm standing. I'm unaware of where to go. You know the word ghafla comes from ghafl. Ardun ghafl. Land that is covered completely and there's not even footprints or tracks or anything, and you're standing in the middle of a desolate place. You don't know which way civilization is. You don't see smoke in the distance. You don't see lights. Nothing. And where am I even standing? That place is called ghafl. When you don't even know where you're standing, so how are you going to know where you're going to go? You're aimless, completely, utterly clueless. That's actually the situation called ghafl or ghafla. Allah says, أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْغَافِلُونَ. Allah didn't make us ghafil. Allah made us aware. Allah made us aware of what destination we should be working towards and how we're supposed to get there. He gave us a recalibration of our focus 5 times a day. Stand in front of Allah, recite Allah's word, you'll recalibrate. Okay. I got distracted for a few hours. Straighten out. Let that battery run for a while. It's going to start going low. Get in front of Allah again. Rejuvenate. Focus again. And what an amazing exercise to focus. Stand in front of Allah. Stand in front of Allah. That's the entire practice. And how beautiful that we call on Allah's beautiful names, starting with the Fatiha in the Salah. When Allah says, وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى فَادْعُوهُ بِهَا. From the beginning, Allahu Akbar, actually what we're doing is calling on Allah by His beautiful names in the Salah itself. The Salah becomes an antidote to this life of, mindless existence. Muslims have to snap out of that. We have to snap out of that. We have to become mindful people. We cannot become cattle. And we have to look into ourselves. Hey, how much of my life is like a cow now? How much of it is like a cow? I have to ask myself that hard question. How much of it is dulled? How much of it is I'm just doing things for the sake of doing things I don't even know why? One last thing came to my head. I'm going to share it with you. You're going to hate me for it. That's okay. Sometimes there are people that are visionaries in any community. There's somebody who says, I want to do something for Islam. I want to bring Islam to this place. I want to build something. I want to build Allah's house. They're going to teach Allah's book there. They're going to tell people about Allah there. We're going to educate our kids there. We're going to give da'wah to non-Muslims there. We're going to do this. It's got this vision. This guy's got a vision. And it's just one guy. He just has this idea. And he's a bus driver. He doesn't have any money, but he has this intention. And he gets some friends together and they get a little corner in his apartment somewhere, they start praying together, and they work hard, and they had this vision, right? And they keep building on that vision, and they finally get a masjid or something, and it gets bigger and bigger, and that person dies. That person dies. But the institution is still there. And then a new board gets elected, and they have a fundraiser, and they get a nicer place. Then they have another fundraiser, then they get a nicer chandelier. Then they get another fundraiser, and they get new carpet. Then they keep getting fundraisers for newer carpets and fans and things, right? And they keep getting that. And you know what? All the discussions in every meeting is next year's fundraiser. Where we only have this many kids in the school, and we have this many kids, or they're celebrating. These many kids are going to the HIPS program. These many kids are doing this. These many kids are doing that. And nobody's thinking, wait, we had a vision. We're doing this stuff, but we had a vision. Like, we had a vision to serve beyond what is being served. Are we saying we've already achieved it and there are no more services to be provided? Or are we saying there are other horizons that need to be crossed and we need to constantly be pushing for excellence? And what happens to our institutions? We become stagnant. They started with people that are driven, that are visionaries, that are looking to do the impossible, and eventually they become run by people over time, basically cows. Just eat the fodder, go back to keep the status quo. This is how we always did things. This is just how we did things. What do businesses, good businesses, what do? Do you know that? Good businesses, they keep an eye on the market, they keep an eye on the environment. They're like, how do we improve our service? How do we attract new customers? How do we provide something that the competition isn't providing? They're constantly ingenuitive. They're constantly maneuvering, changing plans. Why? Because that's what business requires. You have to keep up. And if you have a really good leadership, they're always improving, right? But what happens in, cow organizations? Cow organizations, we have to keep, this is how we always did things, brother. This is how we do things here, okay? And then when you say, hey, there are these ideas, here's what you should implement. Here, the youth in this community came up with this innovative idea. You should implement this. It'll help a lot with the college kids. It'll help with kids that are losing their faith. It'll help with kids that are heading towards drugs, etc., etc. Brother, we're doing a lot, mashallah. We already do all these things. Everything. So we do it already. It's already done. Thank you, though. Thank you for your suggestion. But mashallah, let me show you our new classroom. And let me show you this table. We got this new table for our children. They can sit on this table. There's no ingenuity. It's not just that people become cows. Institutions become cows. Institutions become dull. They don't recognize the problem. Look at what happened in the Ummah. You have, in Muslim countries, places where there are ulama being trained. Ulama of Islam being trained. They're going to graduate and they're going to become an alim of Islam. And a mile away from there, there's a university where young men and women in the Muslim world are becoming atheists by the hundreds and the thousands. A mile away. And if one of those kids that's becoming an atheist walks over to the newly graduated, this 25-year-old graduated from his university, this 25-year-old graduated, became an alim, and they end up at a coffee shop together. And the university kid starts asking him questions about God, asks him questions about, Sam Harris, starts talking to him about LGBT, starts talking to him about, the modern economy and how does riba work in a modern economy. And this kid who graduated from the other side is like, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. You know what I think? I think you need ruqya. I think that's what you need. Why? Because in some places in the Muslim world, we allowed our institutions to become cows. An aware being is looking at the reality around them and saying, hey, here's the problem that our religion came to solve. Our religion came to solve corruption. Our religion came to solve doubt. Our religion came to solve these are the issues happening in society. Now we are the institution of learning. We're going to learn the problem and we're going to discover the solution because we're the institution of learning. That's what was supposed to be the case. But now, and there are few institutions in the world that are actually doing that. Allah reward them. But that needs to become a global phenomenon. We we need to now think really about what kinds of efforts are we not only a part of, what are we supporting, what kinds of efforts are we going to be creating. We have to create thoughtful institutions. We have to fight becoming cattle, inshallah, to the best of our ability. With these few thoughts, inshallah, I'll leave you be. Please do recite these ayat on your own and just sit there and contemplate them for yourselves personally. What might open up to you for your own personal selves may be very different from even what you hear from me. Barakallahu li wa lakum fil Qur'an al-Hakim wa nafa'ani wa iyyakum bil ayat wa dhikr al-Hakim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. There are almost 50,000 students around the world that are interested, on top of the students we have, in studying the Quran and its meanings and being able to learn that and share that with family and friends. And they need sponsorships, which is not very expensive. So if you can help sponsor students on Bayyinah TV, please do so and visit our sponsorship page. I appreciate it so much and pray that Allah gives our mission success and we're able to share the meanings of the Quran and the beauty of it the world over.